Welcome to the Creative Conference. I am Harrison Ellis.
And I am Mavro Diamonti, and we are the Rockstar Brothers.
So first, Mav, I believe we're talking about our intro to the film industry. So I can start for myself. So my intro to film started with my mom, I guess, the earliest stages. She took me to the theater. I saw pretty much every film premiere in like the early 90s and early 2000s. My mom was a big film buff, so immediately, like watching Star Wars, I was like, I want to do this. And then I got into it in high school. I kept following it. Of course, I did sports, but ultimately, I felt like it was my calling. So I continued to pursue it. And then I finally got my shot, I guess, in creative and development, and really got an understanding of what that was because I had no idea what development was. And then, quickly sort of started to rise the ranks into where I am today. And I guess that's my quick, brief overview.
I think I've had a similar journey into film, Harrison. For me, it was at an early age, growing up in Africa, Guinea, it was like Bollywood. That's how I got introduced into filmmaking. So Bollywood was like, immediately when I saw it, I was like, this is pretty fun. People, being on the screen, being able to do things that they love and being able to be in different worlds at the same time. From there, studying film and theater in my undergrad, I immediately was just like, I want to do this for a living. I want to play for a living. I want to create stories for a living. And then continuing my education further into the industry, and then being fortunate enough to be where I am now and diving into, creating stories and writing scripts and developing projects and just learning about what it means to be a storyteller. So that's a brief overview of how I got here.
So who are some of your early influences?
Early influences.
I know that's a trick question because it's like for us, like that's constantly evolving, so.
I'll be honest, man, like when I first got here, some of the earliest people I even knew about before I even came to the States were like the Denzels of the world, the Wesley Snipes of the world. But because, back home, I'm not only just getting American cinema, I was introduced to like, Bruce Lee at like a young age, like Jean-Claude Van Damme at a young age. So it was always like international superstars, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Sylvester Stallone. But when it came down to actually understanding what storytelling was and who the people are that are behind the scenes, and I'm sure when you start talking about yours, it's almost like we see the people on the camera, but we don't see the people that are making it. And it was until you kind of dove into it, you start seeing like, whoa, there are people that actually write these movies. So for me, it was like Spike Lee was like one of my earliest inspirations, just because when you think about Black cinema, he's at the forefront. John Singleton, for sure, just because I feel like he's one of the most underrated Black filmmakers of all time. And then diving into other worlds, obviously, I go by the Black Chris Nolan. So definitely Chris Nolan. And then up to date, I'm really, really impressed with what Ryan Coogler does, just because I feel like he's bridging the gap with generations and being able to do things that are commercial, but still important within the Black community. What about you?
Like,
I'm curious.
my early influences was all about the screen. So like Tom Cruise and Will Smith were it, right? Like that was box office. Like if they had a movie coming out, it was huge. So for me, it was all like shiny. I didn't really care about indie films. I didn't care about things that didn't have large IPs attached. It was all about like the biggest films, the biggest release, the stuff that everybody was talking about. And I was addicted. Like my mom loved, first of all, like all of the influences were from my mom because my mom was taking me to the theater. I couldn't go myself. So a lot of those are, I guess, men with their shirts off, right? So I was watching a lot of the big films, and I mean, of course, it transitioned to Matt Damon and the Bourne series. So it was just a lot of like, big action, explosion. And then like the stuff that I felt like story-wise influenced me was like the Jurassic Parks, just the large franchises. Like I was like as a child, just like very much like this is amazing. Like I felt like, I mean, we would literally have like our own reviews outside of the theater. I had a large family, so it was like, we would be in the theater, all 7 of us, all the kids basically, and my mom and my auntie. And it would just be like, we'll have our whole reviews. Everybody's talking about what they liked, they didn't like. So when I first got into film, I started in theater as an actor and tried to like really like, what does this mean, acting and like understanding that world of it all. And then I learned about, the other people, like the writers, the directors, all the other people, all the other components that make up a film. And that's when I really fell in love. And that's when the influences started to shift. So it's like high school, I'm starting to like understand what filmmaking is. I was making short films in high school, and that's when I was like, okay, like, there's Spike Lee, this guy who like, comes out of New York and, has a crazy point of view, and is very subjective with how he uses the camera. And I was just like really enthralled with his approach to filmmaking. And then sort of like his revolutionary like approach in life, I thought was pretty unique and interesting as well. So it's like I started all shiny, and then I understood the process. And then that's when I was like, okay, I have different, like my influences are different. And, of course, like the Aaron Sorkins, the Chris Nolans, the Tarantinos, all of those people, all the greats that we call them in our industry. Of course, they've inspired me in numerous ways, but ultimately today, I would say probably the most influential person is Spike when it comes to just like being true to myself and having a unique point of view.
Let me ask you this, man, because talking about, your mom and your families being how you were kind of introduced to film, which is very much similar to me. For me personally, it was like an escape for whatever was happening at that time. Did you feel like there was a sense of like going to the movies was like, hey, we get away from whatever struggles we're dealing with now? Because that ultimately kind of pushed me into, I want to pen these stories because I know how much of an influence you can have with just filmmaking.
I mean, honestly, of course, right? Like if Star Wars was coming out, we're thinking about it for 2-3 days that we're all as a family going to see Star Wars. So it immediately escapes you out of your reality because, you're literally not thinking about your reality. You're thinking about, this film. And then when you get to watch it, just seeing the effect it had, because this is back in the day. So theaters were sold out. I feel like it's a shame that kids don't get to see, how the theater experience used to be, where it's like every film was sold out for weeks when it was released. And you knew like you were if you had bragging rights if you were able to talk about it next week because you saw the film.
And you fell out of the loop if you didn't.
Yeah, and if you didn't, so it was a lot of like, for me, I felt like I was fortunate that my mom was a film addict, to the point where I was able to watch a lot of films, be exposed. Us as a family, we were able to talk about like the different approaches to, cinema, even if it's because my mom did theater, but like her understanding isn't even close to like a professional. So, but we were still act like critics, right?
Yeah.
And talk about like, oh, the first one was better than this one, and and all of the different ways and why. So I think it definitely was an escape of reality. And I mean, which is why I love it, because it does, the first time I probably seen my dad cry was in the theaters, right? Like, so like like it is literally like you see the emotional impact that it has on people around you. I've seen applause in theaters as a child. So I saw all of that. And I was just like, this is something I would love to do. I don't know how to do it. I'm in Atlanta, Georgia. It was like very confusing that I wanted to do something that I was like, I don't know how. But luckily I had one of those moms that was just like, anything you want to do, you can put your mind to it, and you can do it, you can achieve it.
Mm-hmm.
So ultimately that's when I sort of set out to be Will Smith.
Similar
Yeah.
upbringings, man. Similar upbringings. I think a good transition then, since we kind of realized or learned together or separately, as far as like just the power that filmmaking has. Do you feel like there is a sense of like, how do you approach filmmaking now, knowing the effect that it can have on people that look like us? Because for me personally, after realizing or seeing, because just to backtrack, you said when you guys left the film, you would be critiquing the film. Me and my mom and my brothers, when we left the film, we'll be debating about what the film was about. Like, what is the theme of the story? So I remember even watching Transformers or watching I Am Legend, like watching The Pursuit of Happiness. We'll be debating on the way home, like, no, the film is about this and it's about that and it's about this. You remember this point of the story? So those type of debates made me more critical or made me more aware of the little nuances within the film, just because it's not all just the, the explosions. So I say that to say, like, do you feel like your experiences and how you got introduced to film now affects how you approach it?
Yeah, of course, right? The biggest approach that I think people don't think about when they're thinking about a story is it going to be entertaining? And for me, that is like a large portion of how I create, because you fall into traps of like creating your own story or creating a story based off of your own experience. And of course, indie films are needed in our industry,
Right.
but it's a very small percentage of films that are being made. And I think as a writer, who also is a director, it's very important for me to have that eye where I'm like, okay, is this going to make my audience like walk out of the theater excited that they just watched my film? So when I think about my experiences of being like just so excited and having like this amazing escape from reality, I think about what what elements did the film have, and what elements does your story have in the black and white to make people feel that sense of like, oh man, I can't believe I just watched that. Like we can all think about certain films that we've seen in life that got us to a point where we were just like, this is unbelievable, to the point where sometimes you even call someone at the end of it because you're just like, yo, have you seen this film? Like,
Yeah.
this is crazy, and I think when you're writing a story, when you're at a point where you're in your draft, you're beginning, middle, end, and if you feel like it's not going to have those elements, you really need to think about your story. Because, yes, it might be based on a true story, or yes, it might be something that is your own truth. And, it's a certain topic that you want to discuss. But when you're trying to make a film that needs to premiere at theaters or on a buyer, I'm not sure what licensing we have, but Netflix, Amazon, if it's something that you want people to see and people to buy and to later be an acquisition play, it has to be entertaining. So, I think about that when I'm approaching a story. It's not the only thing that matters, but when I think about my experiences and what, I went through as an audience member, it's definitely something that I consider when I'm writing a story. So yeah, what about you?
So you made some great points, man. I think for me personally, because we're obviously African Americans, and we become so influenced with what's on the screen, and I feel like we see that now more than ever. How I kind of look at how I approach a story is, what is this film saying? Like, I approach it like how musicians approach albums, because once you put out there, it lives for an eternity. You can never get it back. So I think about, and when I think about that, it's more so, okay, what message am I putting out into the world? What am I trying to say with this specific project? What type of themes and subtextual stuff am I putting out there? Just because that is how I will be remembered. And you know how important it is for you to continue to making films. It depends on the success of the last film you made. And majority of filmmakers or directors or producers, writers, they're only as good as that one project that made them huge. So I also think about how entertaining the project is. But for me personally, because I knew filmmaking is the reason why, I am the person that I am. Like, to your point, there are certain films that literally made me become who I am now. Like freaking The Pursuit of Happiness. That's one of those films where it's like, you know what, like it was an inspirational film and it made me inspired walking out of the theater. I can't even think of all the films, but just be thinking about how much of an effect it can have on your character as a person, it made me more intentional about, what my characters are saying. What is this story about? What's the plot? And overall, what is that feeling that I want people to leave the theater feeling? Is it joy? Is it despair? Is it pick up the phone and call your mom and tell them you love them? Is it, be more intentional with your own life? Is it don't take anything for granted? You know what I'm saying? Yeah. So for me, I think it's very much just what is this message and what is the voice that is coming from this movie?
And so like I think to get into more even technical elements, because a lot of people that I see, like a lot of like new writers, the traps that I see them fall into is they just go, I have this idea, I'm going to start writing a script. And when you are talking about your approach to a story, there's so many things and steps that need to happen before you're at the point where you're writing your script. And it's hard, when you're reading these books, when you're seeing all of these people win all of these awards and, they look like you or they're from the same town as you, and you're just
Yeah.
like, I can do it too.
Mhm.
So you ultimately start to try to skip steps. So to get to a more detailed like approach to story, like I think it's very important that people understand like there's about 5 to 6 steps before you actually start writing your script,
Mhm.
that you have to consider. And of course, the log line is that very first step. But even sometimes before the log line, which I think is very important, is like having thorough brainstorm sessions, right? Like people say ideas come from everywhere, and that's true. Like me as a writer, I remember when I first got started in film and all writers would tell me like, oh, you're gonna have a book, you're just gonna be writing out things like, and I've become the person that hears things at parties and I'm just like, oh, that would that's a
Yeah.
truthful conversation,
Yeah.
like it's something that feels like I might be able to use that in my material later. So I think that's I was at the airport the other day. Two girls were talking, and then the girl was just like, I haven't really like, are you engaged yet? Like I haven't. And I was just like, they got into where they were at in both of their relationships, and I was just like, oh my gosh, I can like write for women because it was just so organic in the way that they were able to just talk about their relationships. And I was a peeping Tom, I think that's the right term for it.
Yeah.
But as a writer, like when you're approaching a story, it's not just like, oh, I have this idea, let's go write it. You
Right.
know, it's really about brainstorming, figuring out what the story you're trying to tell, figuring out what stories work within the genre, the research. And this is all before you're writing your log line. And
Mhm.
people don't understand, like, when you're talking about your approach to story and you're just like, hey, I had this idea for a few years and, I want to tell this story. And I think, and I hear that so much. And I just say, okay, what films have been made in that genre? What are the comps to that
Mhm.
story?
Mhm.
Like when and I think that's when I usually lose people. They'll be like, oh, I never thought of that. And I'm just like, it's the most important thing because people are investing millions of dollars into your film. And it may not be, a studio film or an indie feature. It might just be a short film, right? But if you're making a short film just to make a short film, you can do whatever you want, right? But if you're making a short film to make, peers in our industry, take a look at you and consider you as someone who might be talented, then you have to kind of sort of follow the tropes and follow the trends and figure out like, okay, why was their short film within this genre successful as compared to just, hey, I have this idea and I want to write it, all walls are up. I don't want to hear any notes. It's like you have to really have a thorough brainstorm before you before you put pen to paper. And I think that's something that a lot of writers need to know, because it will not only save you time, but it'll also do a lot of justice to your story.
I couldn't agree anymore, man. And I think the skipping step is something that we kind of see a little bit too often because majority of what happens is most of the time is people fall into the trap of thinking that an idea is a story. An idea is not a story. Everybody has ideas. Ideas come by the dozen. And when it comes down to having a story, there are certain beats, there are certain moments within the film that are continuously proven. And that's why you see the success of certain films. You see the formula, becomes produced over and over and over again. Like it's a reason why certain films are so successful. So going into the technical of filmmaking, or even before you even get to that point, for me personally, it's reading films that fit within the type of film you're trying to make. So if you're trying to make a rom-com, go study rom-coms and figure out why is it that people, when they go to a movie, they love rom-coms, because there's certain things within a rom-com that have to happen. Usually it's boy meets girl or girl meets boy. And then throughout the end of the story, they either end up together or they don't end up together. And if you're making a superhero film, within the next few minutes, there needs to be a superhero within the film. And if you're making a crime thriller, within the first act of the film, there should be a crime. And if there isn't, people are going to be sitting there throughout the entire film wondering, where is the crime? This is a crime thriller. Or if it's a scary movie and you're halfway through the film and you haven't been scared one time, people are going to walk out and say, what the hell? This is supposed to be a scary movie. Why have I not been scared? So when you speak about genres, I think that's one of the most misunderstood points in storytelling or writing in general, just because everybody thinks that, oh, you have an original idea, I can just write it. It's my personal story. It's so near and dear to me. It's amazing because it was crazy. This happened to me. There is nothing new under the sun that people have not seen. And I think, to your point about majority of the films that are being made in Hollywood, they're not original stories. They're adaptations from comic books or articles or actual events or biopics, the whole nine. So I think that with me specifically, it begins with the research, because I even remember, when it came down to you and I writing for a certain B-list celebrity, it was like, okay, tackling this rom-com world was interesting just because we understood, like, okay, what are the certain nuances that work within When Harry Met Sally? Why was When Harry Met Sally one of the most successful rom-coms of all time? And in reading the scripts, it was like, oh, of course, like they carefully crafted those characters, which kind of leads us into our next point. Like, I think when it comes down to crafting stories, it all depends on either the plot or the characters that you are creating within it. And that's something that I know me and you, we take pride in. And even kind of going back to what you said about just, you can get material. That's what my exec calls it. You can get material wherever you are. Like, you were in the airport and you said you heard that conversation. I was at the garage, the auto garage, like a few weeks ago, and I was getting my car fixed, and I'm listening to the two mechanics argue about something that's happening on social media. And I was literally laughing in my mind, was just like, I have a show that I'm about to develop that's within the world of a garage. This is like material for that, because it was so authentic. And that's something, it's like, I literally wrote down the entire conversations about just the different characters and the different tropes. So I think ideas can become stories, but they have to be fully developed. You have to do the necessary research. You don't just dive head in and write a script. And I think majority of the time, that's when certain ideas die, when you flush them out too quick, when you don't start with the beat sheet and then go into a treatment and then go into a full outline and then dive into a script. Majority of the people, they just go from idea to script. And that's where a lot of dreams die.
Yeah, I agree. And I want to touch on characters just to kind of really give people a better idea of like how we develop characters and how important characters are to your story. I think about, and this just because it's on my mind, I recently watched the John Wick 4, and this is a story about an assassin who, historically, if you're a fan of the franchise, you understand that he's a man of few words, right? And I thought about like how people, praise people like Tarantino, where it's like his character development is amazing and the dialogue, and you can kind of just hear each character's voice. But what's interesting is like even the lack of dialogue can be a character choice,
100%.
to the point where the top of the film in John Wick 4, it's like this the director does like this fast zoom motion into Keanu Reeves's face, and then he just goes, yeah. And the entire theater just busts out laughing because we know he's a man of few words, right? So it's like when you're creating characters, I think it's so important to give them nuances, right? Give them their own voice, of course. And then I think what's really unique is like character placement, right? Like every character shouldn't be in every scene. How are you using these characters throughout your film, to sort of, push the plots further, but as well as add value to the scene? Because to my first point, we are telling stories so people will enjoy them. Even if it's something that's uncomfortable, we still want people to be like, that's a crazy issue. I want to do something about it. We want to empower people. So whenever we're telling stories, horror, to rom-com, it's still so people can enjoy it in some form of fashion. So characters are essential in that. As we know, those are the voices of the page. And yeah, I just think it's a very important topic to kind of talk about when you're talking about making any screenplay.
So when it comes to characters, I'll be honest, it's one of my favorite parts of writing, just because you get to get into a world, or you get to almost become a person for a script for however long that film is. You know what I'm saying? And character placement is not only important, I think it's critical when you also start thinking about how different is this character from everybody else in the world. And that's when people start falling in love with a certain person, excuse me. And I feel like one of the most successful filmmakers within that, who's just always been great at that, obviously, is Tarantino. And, it's so important just because for him, he even puts them in a different costume, just because I want you to automatically associate that person with a certain vibe, certain energy, certain language, certain essence. So as soon as they walk in the room, it's like, yeah, that's Pulp Fiction. That's Samuel Jackson's character. He's going to do shit. He's going to talk crazy. He's going to be violent. But at the end of the day, he's also has a soft heart, and he's going to talk to you about the Bible. You know what I'm saying? So many different nuances so that there's a certain archetype to them, but you almost can't guess what they're going to do next. And that's what I love when we go into characters, just because obviously there's a hero, there's a villain, there's a anti-villain, there's a fake opponent ally, there's an ally who becomes an opponent. When I start thinking about all those different archetypes, I always like playing with the idea of, okay, well, everybody thinks that this villain is just a prototypical villain, but how can we make this villain like the Joker in The Dark Knight, where it's like, he's a villain, but what he's about to tell you can actually be something that Batman could say. Like, he also has a point too. Like, majority of the audience can also say, you know what? Yeah, I'm rooting for Batman, but you know what? I'm rooting for the Joker too. Or even talking about Todd Phillips' Joker. That's the first time we've seen a character like that be put in a world where, you know what? He's the hero of the story. And you start learning about all the different things that he's dealing with, to the point where you're not even looking at him as a villain anymore. You genuinely care about him. So I think when it comes down to characters, it's thinking about what has been done before. How can you switch this person up? How can you give them a unique voice that people are not used to? How can you make them unique to a person, to a place, to a town, to a time, to a specific region in the world, to a specific culture, to a specific mindset? Like, all of those things go into to note when you start thinking about, how do I create these people? Because they're not just people on a page. If you want actors to be able to pick up your script and immediately love it, it comes down to, they need to be able to read the script and immediately differentiate different characters without even looking at their names, just based off of what they sound like. And that's something that I learned over and over, even studying films like, what was it, Good Will Hunting. When you hear Robin Williams' character talks on there, when he talks about, the Michelangelo painting, it's like little nuances like that that make him so unique to the story, compared to Matt Damon's character, who's like all tough, and you know what I'm saying, until he actually ultimately becomes that hero of the story that changes. So I think when it comes to characters, it's definitely voice, but it's also, how do these people start the story, and how do they change? So I think character arcs is something that most people do not understand, but it's definitely one of the most important, because if someone starts to how they ended, yeah, it can be exciting. But if you start a film and the character is one way and you see them change, that's how ultimately you get the audience to change. That's how you show people, hey, this person has a flaw in the beginning. How do we show them how they can overcome this flaw? Or do they overcome this flaw? And I remember a few days ago, you and I were talking about, just some of our favorite films. And me personally, it's like The Godfather, just because I love Michael Corleone's character, how they start him as an innocent guy, doesn't want nothing to do with his family. And by the end of the film, he steps into this ruthless role as the Godfather, and he's more ruthless than his dad. So he goes from good guy to bad guy. So I think those changes throughout the story is just as important, if not more important, than the voice that you give certain characters.
And to what you said at the beginning, what you have seen, right? So as you're referencing characters, you have to watch films, you have to study scripts to say, how did they create a character that just popped in my mind? Um, when you're like referencing all of these films, it's very important for you to, as a writer, as a filmmaker, to go back and say, what did this filmmaker or this writer do to where I'm hooked to this character? I can't get this character out of my mind, and then reverse engineer it. And then from there, you'll be able to examine and understand, okay, these are the certain nuances that he did or that he or she did to create this character. Um, and I just think that's, like it goes back to what we talked about beforehand, where it's like before you're writing the research, because the research of the genre, the research of the world will allow you to make great character choices. So when you do, after you knock out your first draft, you can come back and you're not just starting from scratch with your characters. You've already have unique voices. You already have unique placement, but now you just got to fluff it up a little bit. So I just think, just going back to what you talked about beforehand, like just it all goes back to the research. It all goes back to having an understanding of you as a filmmaker. What do you like? Where your taste aligns, so you can go back and study it and say, I want to create a character as unique as that. So
And I think just to add to that too, Harrison, you just said something that sparked something. Even when you talk about John Wick and creating John Wick, you can't make a John Wick without understanding Jason Bourne, Jack Reacher, Mission Impossible, James Bond, huh?
Equalizer.
You can't make a John Wick without understanding all the films within that world that have been done before, and then being able to say, okay, how do I do this? And if I do this, why is John Wick different from a Jason Bourne? Why is John Wick different from a Jack Reacher? Why is John Wick different from a James Bond? And it starts with that character. And then you just say he's a man of a few words. People come and they love John Wick because he's a man of few words. So if he was anything different, if he was more like Jack Reacher, they'll be like, oh, we've seen this person before. So the filmmakers who made the project, I'm sure they have an understanding of, hey, this is the world in which we're creating. This is the character. He's different from these people because X, Y, and Z. And this is why people are going to love him, because he's different in these ways. So I think the research is so important, just because you can't create a new idea without knowing what ideas have been created before.
So the next thing on the ballot is our process. And I think if you've seen Seth Rogen speak, every film has a different process. Every project, because I won't even just say film, because we do TV as well. Every project has a unique process. And the only thing that, in my opinion, because there are some things that are very consistent, but the one thing that is very vital, I think, at the beginning of all of our projects, for our process, is the research. So whenever we are approaching a project, and just to give everyone context, like as a writer in this industry, it's not just, hey, I have this idea, I want to write it. That's not how it works, unfortunately. It does when you're beginning, right? Because you have to get your ideas seen, you have to get your voices heard, and then people will start contacting you, and then you'll be able to kind of, get the ball rolling a little bit. But, once you start getting the ball rolling, you'll get more, jobs or mandates, and, or talent specific projects where, people are hiring you and saying, hey, I have this talent. Do you have anything that works in this genre for this talent, XXX? And you, as a writer, have to create it. So the first thing, of course, is the research. I don't want to harp too much on that, but researching every genre, researching the talent's life, watching all of their films, watching the producer's films. If it's a certain producer that's hiring you, to figure out, what sort of projects are they known for, or are they or do they produce well? Because that all comes into play. But, after you're done with the research, I think, we jump into a brainstorm, right? And what would you consider some of the most important things that, like, elements of the brainstorm that really, I feel like the first thing, of course, is no idea is too small, right?
Yeah.
But talk to me about your
So
brainstorming
when
and
it
your side.
When it comes to our brainstorms or just a brainstorm in general, it's like everything goes or anything goes. It's like there's no idea as a dumb idea. And it's also about knowing what fits within this genre. So when it comes down to the brainstorms, it's knowing, okay, if we're going to throw ideas out there, it still has to make sense with what we're trying to pitch or what we're trying to develop. So some of the most critical things is knowing what fits, knowing just the little nuances and the beats. That's the first thing. And another thing when it comes down to brainstorm is also knowing what's been done before, because you never want to repeat stories, you never want to repeat plots, you never want to repeat characters. You can repeat character archetypes, but you can't repeat exact characters. And then also when it comes down to brainstorming is how can you put a twist on what people expect you to do? I think that is so critical, especially if you want to make a new voice for yourself. You want people to come down to your story or be raving about your story and be sharing it, or it be the #1 in the world or #1 on Netflix. Is this guy took this original concept or this quote unquote original concept, put his own twist to it, and then still said something that nobody expected them to say. So I think it's also not being gullible, not being like people can guess exactly what you're about to do next or what this character is going to do or what the story is going to be about. And I think also when it comes down to brainstorming is have fun, man. Like I love brainstorming just because it's literally it's like cooking, man. You're putting things together and you're trying to figure out what sticks, what comes out, what's good, what's bad. And even saying what's bad, I think when it comes down to brainstorming, playing with the dumb ideas, the silly ideas, the strange ideas sometimes can lead to some crazy moments. Like I know personally for me and you, sometimes like we may be saying, no, that won't work. No, that won't work. And I may just go dark on you and say, okay, well, what if he did this? And you'd be like, oh, now you're thinking. Like little things like that. So like literally not being sensitive too. When it comes down to brainstorming, be ready for your idea to just get slapped. Like, no, that doesn't work. That doesn't work. So it's like coming back with another idea and coming back with just like, okay, well, they could do this and they could do that and they could do this. Well, no, that won't. So it's literally, it's playing a game. It's playing a game of like tag, like I say, you say, and also being open to other people's influences, because majority of the time, me and you may not know our answers, but there is also a moment where your brain may say something that sparks my brain. And then before you know it, there's a third brain in the room. You know what I'm saying? And that brain may come up with the answers to whatever we're struggling with at that time, whether it's figuring out how a character gets out from point A to point B, or figuring out, you know, how our hero makes it to the dark night of the soul, or figuring out, okay, well, how do we wrap this up in the end? So I think it's very much being open, but also realizing like sometimes you may not know the answer, but you being in the room and being open to finding the answer may spark someone else in the room to find it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, the only thing I would add to that is brainstorming has no expiration date, right? So you're going to brainstorm and you might put a deadline of a week, but if you feel like your story isn't there yet, you got to keep going and just stay in that brainstorm until you find something that's truly unique. And I will say the more you do it, of course, the better you get at it. But, you know, for if I'm talking to an early screenwriter, stay in that brainstorm world. Keep challenging your story. Like keep figuring out ways to where it's like, okay, I know what worked at Sundance last year because I watched those films. I know what got best original screenplay because I watched that film. Does this story stand against that story? And you might not be trying to achieve those things or do those things, but what are you trying to achieve? Because if you have any goals for your story, you need to match your story against that story, against that project. And if it doesn't stand against it, keep challenging it, keep brainstorming until you find, the story that you ultimately decide to move forward with.
And I think one thing I'll add to that too, when it comes down to brainstorming, and sometimes you have to step away. There are a lot of times where you may just be in a brainstorm for so long and you'll hit that wall. And that's natural as an artist. You'll hit that wall. And art imitates life. So the best way to come back fresh is literally go on a walk. Stephen King sometimes writes and goes on a walk. You know what I'm saying? The best artists have this combination or this balance of, you know what, I'm gonna create and then I'm gonna go hang out with my family, or I'm gonna go hiking this weekend, or I'm gonna go travel, or I'm gonna go shopping. So a lot of times for me, when it comes down to brainstorming, it's like, if you're trying to find that one idea, that one answer within that story, that one hook within that story, sometimes step away from it, give yourself a few hours, give yourself a few days. Sometimes it may be weeks. Even looking at someone like Aaron Sorkin, you talk about, he did the President's Men. Like, he said there was times where he literally would just get in front of his screen and just look at the blank page, and then he would just be thinking about, okay, what to do. And most people would think, oh, that's not a successful writing day. He'll be like, no, that's a successful writing day, because I know now what not to do. So I think a lot of times is understanding that just because you're not putting pen to paper does not mean you're not being productive as a writer. And give yourself time to figure it out, because you may be singing in the shower and you'll be like, I got it. I finally got the answer to what I was thinking about. Or you may be driving and you may immediately come up with, oh my God, like I know exactly the answer. And I know that happens a lot for me and you. We could be out shopping with our wives or grocery shopping or whatever. And you'd be like, bro, I know exactly what we need to do. Like, this is going to be dope. And we're going to do this and we're going to do that. And then we'll text each other and call and be like, that's it. That's exactly it. So I think be open and give yourself time, because it comes when you stay in that moment.
Yeah, I agree. You can't force an idea. Forcing ideas leads you to a film that's been shot and doesn't have an ending, right? So you gotta really organically, try to put yourself in the best position to create amazing work, and allow yourself the time that's necessary. So after that, I'm gonna skip some steps because I don't want to give everybody too much info. But then we go into our beginning, middle, and end, where we essentially write out our story. And this is just written out paragraph form, get it out, blurt it out. And then we put it in more of a, what we call in the industry, a one pager. And that's a more structured approach and look for your story of your beginning, middle, and end. And then from there, we jump into, really just, I would call it a beat sheet. And then we do a slug line outline. And then this is probably where we spend the most time, because this allows us to really make sure that we're hitting the structures that we need to hit within the genre. It makes it's the entire story laid out. And then, as well as, I think, it's very important for us to clearly see the story, and in its amazingment, if that's a word, but see the story in its rawest form and just really take and just decide, like, hey, is this enough happening here? How can we make it more exciting at the beginning? What's a more unique way to do this? And this is no dialogue, no script, no final draft at this point. We are fully in Word or Google Doc, writing out our slug line outline treatment. And yeah, I know you have some stuff to add on that, Matt, but like, what, in your opinion, why is this stage so important, and why do people spend the most time? Not people, why do we spend the most time in this stage?
For us personally, I think this is the most important step, because it's what you said. You get to see the film from start to finish. And it's easier to fix it now before you go into writing a script, because you're able to see, okay, this scene works because the following scene, this character does this, or this scene doesn't work because this is the end of the second act. So technically, something bad has to happen to him here. This has to be the dark night of the soul. He needs to feel like this is the all is lost moment. So I feel like structurally, this is the most important part of the script writing process for us, just because we're able to see the film from start to finish. We're able to see the pitfalls. We're able to follow the characters' journeys. We're able to, even though it's without dialogue, we're able to see the character's arc. Like, okay, he started here, but this is where he's at now. Another reason I feel like it's important is also because you get to match it with the genre of films that you've seen before. So if you're writing a rom-com and you're in the outline phase, or we're in our outline phase, if we pitch it against a When Harry Met Sally, or what's another, freaking The Proposal, or How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days, or whatever rom-com that you think of that fits within that world, it's like, or Love Jones, you know what I'm saying? Whatever film that you're trying to make, what happened within that minute marker or within this scene in the film? Because you may think that was like, oh, they just put that scene there, but no, that scene is like a formula. It's literally like math Like that scene is a formula. That scene has to be there for the rest of the film to feel like a film, but also for it to continue to play out like a story, and then for the audience to ultimately, want to feel like, they love these characters. They love this man and woman that you introduce. So I feel like it's one of the most important parts, just because you have to hit those beats if you're working within the genre. You have to understand where exactly the pitfalls or the holes are within your story. You have to understand, okay, am I missing anything in terms of, have we wrapped up the entire project? And I think it's a lot easier to see that when you're not in the script. And what most people make a mistake of doing, and we've been victim of this in the past, trying to fix something within the script. You don't fix anything within the script. You go back to the outline, because the outline is almost like a blueprint to the house. You go back to it and you see exactly, okay, well, if this is the entire story laid out, why is it not working? What characters are in this world that do not work? And I think a lot of times it's a lot easier to see that when you're not in the script, because you can get lost in the script and feel like, oh, you fixed the mistake here, but you forgot that earlier in the story, this character gets introduced. So this scene is not your only problem anymore. You actually have like an act problem, not even a scene problem. Now you got to revamp the entire act so that the rest of the film makes sense. So I think that's why it's one of the most important parts of our process. And I am curious, because with you seeing the development side of things, what mistakes do you see people make before they even get to the script and developing their story?
Before we get, so say it again, before we get to the script?
Before they get to the script, what mistakes you think most writers or new writers make before they even get to the writing phase?
I think probably the most common mistake I see with scripts are genre mistakes, where it's this type of story has a hard ending or doesn't really have an ending, and it's like, this doesn't make sense, to the point where you have to go back and you kind of, and I mean, we've literally made this mistake before where we go 20 pages and we're in a different, and it's not like too far left, but if this is an action film, action needs to happen. You can't get too caught up in the love story, So it's like certain things like that, where if you fix it in the outline, you're going to be okay. But if you get to a script and you're still trying to make those mistakes, you have to scrap 40 pages. It's a lot easier to change 20, 25 pages of material than 90 to 115. It's a lot easier. So for me personally, I see a lot of genre mistakes where people are just, confused in a way, but ultimately they're trying to tell a story that's new. They haven't really studied the genre, and they don't really understand, like, hey, this is a rom-com. It needs to have a light twist. It needs to have something happen that's not as obvious as them getting, we know they're going to get together. So like, what else are you delivering within this story? And it might be just the job. It might be the trade. You're trying to show something new within a world that people haven't seen before, which is perfectly fine, but if you had this guy who's trying to, start his magazine business, by the end of the film, he needs to either start it, but you can't just forget about that storyline, and you see a lot of things like that where people aren't doing the twist, or people aren't adding, or people aren't sticking to the genre ultimately. So, and I think the biggest thing I'll tell for like beginning writers, I think that's super important, is writing in a way where you have constraints. Because I think if you, as a beginning writer, it's very easy to write anything. I think that is the problem. Like for me specifically, when I was starting off, where I was trying to write anything, and because I was trying to write anything, nothing was finishing. Like you never got to the end, right? And then the ones that you got to the end, you're just like confused at the story. You're like, what did I write? Right? So it's like, hey, set yourself up as if you got a job. Give yourself a job. Hey, your job is you need to write a rom-com, and your rom-com needs to be XX. And then write it as if it's a job and get the job done. I think that's more of what like beginning writers need to take on, like take ownership and just allow themselves to fit within some constraints, and then that will allow them to get to the end and get over that hump, and then have a successful career, hopefully, right?
No, I love what you just said, man. I think the constraints can be accomplished by focusing on one thing: structure, understanding structure. I think that's something that even early on, it killed us just because we had scripts that we started and they didn't get finished. You had scripts that you were working on, and I had scripts that we were working on, and they just died, or we just never mentioned them again just because we didn't understand structure. But the moment me and you not only paid attention to why certain films work and why certain films don't work, and I think that's equally as important, understanding why certain films do not work. When you understand the structure, it's like, exactly, okay, the first act, you're introducing the character, and then boom, by the end of the first act, there's an inciting incident, and then that leads them into the second act. And then the second act, part A, he's going through that world, he's figuring it out, he's falling, picking himself back up again. The second part of act 2, he's figuring it out, something bad happens, that leads him into the dark night of the soul, the all is lost moment. And then that leads him into him changing or not changing, because that's important. Sometimes people change, sometimes they don't change. And then in the third act, you're wrapping it up. This person is a new person. So now he's literally ultimately becoming the person that you knew, completely opposite from who he was, which you established in the first act of the story. And I think when we realized why certain films work, we were able to hit it, because then we knew exactly what needs to happen and certain little nuances. And I think studying and reading, I can't go back to that enough, man. Studying and reading scripts. You cannot become a writer without reading scripts. You can't become a writer without watching films and seeing why certain things work and why they do not work. Just because you're able to, it's literally a formula to all of this. Like these films that are coming out nowadays, there's no something mind-blowing new a part of it. These are the same formulas, different faces, different worlds, different circumstances, different plots, different all of that. But when you strip all of that away, it's literally the same exact story. All rom-coms are the same exact story. All superhero films, same exact story. So I think when you understand structure, it goes a long way, just because you're not wasting your time anymore. You're not wasting time that you could be writing something that you would love and be proud of. And me personally, this is what helped me kind of grow as a writer. One of the most successful production company studios out there that I feel like always nail it when it comes to writing, Pixar. Pixar is so amazing at writing films, from Toy Story to, goodness, man, Shark Tales to all of those films are so immaculate, so amazing as far as how they craft their story, how one person changes from beginning to end. Who are the different characters that you need next to that person? They always nail it no matter what film. And the most recent one I watched, Soul, was such a well-written film. They just always hit it with the characters. And I think when you understand how certain characters fit within a certain genre, you can do no wrong.
Yeah, I mean, it's a family friendly in general. Just has to hit those beats so clear because they don't have dead bodies popping up that is going to carry your plot 10 pages, So I think that studying family films, hero films as well, it's very clear protagonists, clear antagonists. Those are great films to study to ultimately, build out your own style and get a better understanding of structure and why it's so important for every film.
And I think one thing too that I've done over time is read your favorite film. Everyone has a favorite film. So go print that script out, read that script while you're watching the movie. You literally see how they were able to come up with these things, because it's different with just watching the movie. You're just be pulled into being entertained. It's different when you have the script in front of you and you almost have to read it like a book and be able to pause it and see, oh, well, this whole scene was written down in 3 or 4 pages, but it only played out in like 2 or 3 minutes on the screen. And that helped me understand, like, okay, execution on the page versus execution on the screen is 2 completely different things. And understanding the language of script writing is just as important as understanding what the script is about, just because you have to know how these things will translate. You can't just write something and think that, it's all flowery language and it's going to make sense, but also the opposite. Everything can't be on the nose. And I think, well, my background, everything being comedy, that's something I used to fall into a trap of. Everything cannot be on the nose. People cannot read your story. Sometimes they can't immediately get it. You have to force your audiences or your viewer, your readers, to almost like think a little bit different in order to understand your work, but it still has to fit within the formula of genre or structure.
So we're gonna take some time to talk to creatives, the creatives that are watching. And we're gonna probably just bounce back and forth because this
Okay.
could get, but these are two, and then I mean, I guess of course we have experienced screenwriters watching, and we have unexperienced screenwriters watching. So my first message, I would say, and then goes back to even me as a development exec, is like, if you read novels, you see how novels jump off the page, and people fall into the trap of thinking that their screenplays don't have to jump off the page. I think as a beginning creative, it's very important to, one, blah out your story. And I say blah, I'm like, blah, get it out, like get your story out. But before you're taking it out to studios, pitching it, before you're sending it to your peers, to get notes, before anyone else has eyes on your story, you need to read that first 15 pages, and that 15 pages better jump. It better make you excited to watch the film. And I think people fall into this trap of, like, they go to film school and, they make these short films, and it's just like, hey, you don't want to write too much. You don't want to make it too detailed. This is a collaborative process. You just want to get the words out there. And it's like, no, that's not going to get your film made. Your film has to stand out. Now, if you're just writing TV and this show has been going on for years, yes, you might be able to just write an episode and it feel like an episode. But when you're talking about developing and creating ideas as a creative and selling projects, this needs to read like a novel. It has to be exciting. It has to be interesting. I have to see your film. And yeah, and I just think that's my first message to creatives, to where it's like, challenge yourself on that first 15 pages to make sure that it is just as entertaining as if you are watching the film in front of you.
I love that, man. I think my first message to the creatives is make what you love and what you want to see. Because I think if you as a creative are not passionate about the story you're trying to see, and you're just trying to make something that just fits within the isms and the, everything else that's out there, you'll lose. Just because, don't try to make something that's not true to you. There's someone else that can make that project. They don't need you to make that project. And especially understanding who you are as far as the identity of who you are as a creative, that'll sometimes put you in a box if you don't know what type of films that, one, that you're attracted to, and then two, people expect from you. So I think the biggest thing that I would say the first thing that I would say to creatives is know who you are as a person, know what makes you excited as a filmmaker and what type of stuff you want to create, and then go out there and create the best film that you ever thought would be made, and something that you will watch, something that you will be proud of, something that you will be excited about, that you will be raving about over and over, just because you can't take this serious. We're not saving people. We're not the police. We're not going overseas, and we're not in the army. So if you're going to do this, like, it has to be, you almost have to put a piece of your heart into it. So I think that's so critical, just because one project can take up 10 years of your life. So it's like, if you're going to do this one project, make sure you love this project, and this project speaks about who you are, and this one project speaks about what you love and why you want to do this.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. My second message would be, writers write, right? So if you're a writer and you've written one script, that is not the script you should go around town pitching. That is not the story that's going to make it. You hear all these stories in Hollywood of back in the day where they're like, hey, I wrote one script and it got made. That's twofold. One, on one hand, that's an old industry, right? That's not, though, that the likelihood of that happening today is just non-existent. And then on the other hand, I want people to realize, even when they're hearing that story, that script went through 20 to 30 drafts after that. That the same story that Sylvester Stallone wrote for Rocky isn't the same story that got made. Like, you have to understand that this is a process. This is not an overnight thing. And your first script is not going to be your best script. It might be the best story you ever make. Yes, that's true. But script wise, it is not a perfect script. There are holes in it. It takes years of experience, multiple drafts, to get to a point where you're just writing amazing scripts. And I'm not saying that to like discourage people as writers. I'm saying that to challenge you all to say like, okay, I got through my first script. Let's get to the next one, you know, or I got through my first draft. Let's get to 12 drafts, because that's what it takes, you know. And it's not like, oh my gosh, this is so much work. Like, this is, you're making Star Wars, people. Like, you're trying to make something that's gonna affect the entire United States and potentially the entire world. So it's not just gonna be, hey, I wrote a draft and everybody loved it, you know. Like, that's just not the reality. You have to put in some work and you have to enjoy it, because like, goodness, you're getting paid to write clouds falling from the sky, you know. So like, enjoy that, be happy to go write in the morning and, you know, create fluff. You don't have to go to a desk in a cubicle and, you know, and hate life. So enjoy the process, but know that it's not an overnight success thing.
I love that, man. Especially just have fun doing it. The next note I would have for creatives is do research about who's done it that you want to be like. Whose career do you want to have? Because people leave breadcrumbs on their path to success. So if you're a comedy writer and you want to be like Seth Rogen, put Seth Rogen at the top of your list, because that's who you're up against. And it may be all buddy, man, this is like sports, man. This is war. That's who you're up against. So you got to have that dog in you. You got to know exactly who's at the top of that ladder that you're trying to be like. If you're trying to write films like Tarantino, put Tarantino at the top of your list. That's who you're up against. That's who you're trying to be like. That's who you're after. And it's not saying, you know, you don't like them or you don't have respect for them. No, it's all love. It's all love. But when you watch the Oscars, man, it's like, these people, they want to win. So make stories that literally you're proud of, because make stories that the people that you look up to end up looking up at you. You know what I'm saying? So I think do research as far as the people that you want to be like, but also understand like that's who you're up against. Whether you're writing comedy, whether you're writing horror, whether you're writing sci-fi, whatever it is, know who the greats are and what you're trying to do, because that's who when you put out a project, that's who you're up against. Everybody can't watch everything. So you're battling against viewers. There can't be more than one winner. There just can't. So it's like, know exactly what's out there, because this is war, man. It's a content war out there. So for people to watch your stuff, you literally have to, it's all out. This is war. I won't say it again. This is war. So go out there and create what you love, just because it lives and dies out there. You never can get it back. It's for eternity. It's for eternity. Yeah.
My last message to creatives would be, and this is in regards to like, you know, creatives, like, I want to get an agent. I want people to read my work. Like, where do I go? How does like this entire process, there's so many gatekeepers in Hollywood. Like, what I would say to them is, yes, all of that is true. And it doesn't get easier. You're literally asking for someone to give you millions of dollars to maybe make a successful film. It's hard. This is not an easy path you're going after as a creative. But on the other side of that, if you're doing it for the money, if you're doing it for the fame, if you're doing it for all of those reasons, it's not going to carry you through those hard times where it's like you're in a script and you can't figure out how to get to the next plot. So I challenge you as a writer, whoever, or a filmmaker who's writing this, if you're not passionate about telling stories, this part of the industry is not for you. Like, this part of the industry is for people who are purely passionate about telling stories. Like, and generally, these are people who are probably have been liars in real life, like people who just enjoy telling stories. Like, you know what I mean? Like, we enjoy telling stories. Like before I started writing and like really being in film and doing it serious as my job, I would make jokes at my mom. I would come home and they'll be like, why are you coming home so late? And I'd be like, oh, well, you know, I got into a fight with a guy and then he stabbed me. And then luckily I went and I punched him, and I would just create this like superhero story. But that's what I love, telling stories. Like, I really get off by telling stories and having this, whole weird reality that I create within my head, that I'm able to just put on a page. And then luckily it's not, I'm in the film world where I can also put it on a screen compared to it just lives in the black and white. But I challenge everyone who's watching this to, like, yes, there are Hollywood gatekeepers. Yes, no one cares about your script. Let me repeat that. No one cares about your script. That is Hollywood. Like, how they have 100 scripts on everyone's desk. So it's not about the script. It's not about the gatekeepers. It has to be about you having a passion to tell this story, and that's what's going to carry your career, and that's what's ultimately going to one day allow you to say, hey, mom or dad, or hey, cousin, brother, sister, I have a movie premiere for this project that I wrote. I'm super excited about. I want you guys to come, because the whole everything that you're up against, the agents, the managers, it's real. And I think, like, for me personally, I heard the stories, but I didn't have anyone tell me the real reality of, like, hey, it's real. You're only going to go as far as you ultimately want to go. And I think that's kind of, something that's very important for all these beginning writers to say, hey, maybe this isn't my path because I'm not that passionate about writing scripts. I'm not that passionate about, directing or acting, whatever it is. You need to figure out what you're passionate about, because all of the gatekeepers and all of that stuff is real. So it has to be about something beyond just, hey, I want to be Spike Lee, or hey, I want to be Christopher Nolan or Tarantino, because real reality is you have to work to get there. It's not just, hey, you're writing a dope story. Dope stories are sitting on every desk in Hollywood. Like, I can't express that enough. There are a million dope stories out there that aren't getting made. It has to be, how many stories are you creating? So
So
keep
that
working, work overnight.
that falls perfectly with what my last note is, man. This industry is filled with everybody wanting to be dreamers, wanting to be filmmakers. It seems like it's the most funnest job in the world. Behind the camera, behind the scenes, it is gruesome, it is tiresome, it is draining, it is depressing at times, it is tiring, it literally pulls you away from your family. But you have to love what you do. It starts there. You have to love what you do, because there are going to be times, to his point, where you're going to be writing a script and it's up to you to figure it out. And you're up at 4 a.m. and you have to just figure out how to get to the end of the story. So love what you do the work, put in the time, because what's going to separate you from anybody else that's out there is the work that you're putting in. And I take pride at times when I see my peers out partying and me and Harrison are on our Zoom at 2 a.m. figuring out a story. I take pride in that, because I know that's what's ultimately going to get us to where we want to be. I take pride in knowing that, okay, well, the difference between me and Harrison is people can say that they want this, but me and him are going to put in the work. So put in the work, because a lot of people want what you want. You don't get it just because you want it. A lot of people want it. A lot of people want to be Denzel Washington. A lot of people want to be Spike Lee. A lot of people want to be Ryan Coogler. There are very few people who are going to do the work to get them there. Very few people. So I think do the work and figure out exactly who it is that you want to be, not be like, but who it is you want to be that fits within that ism or whoever is that's out there. Okay, what is it that's going to take? Because everybody can dream, but sometimes you got to take a step back and say, okay, what is it going to take for me to become that person? And be real with yourself. Don't lie. You can't try to be Jay-Z and then not want to put in the work. You can't try to be like freaking Mahershala Ali or Michael B. Jordan and not put in the work. It just doesn't happen like that, man. It doesn't happen like that. So put in the work. When your friends are out there partying, drinking, vacationing, doing all that stuff, the stuff that's going to make you be great is what are you doing at that time? Are you at home reading a script? Are you studying a film? Are you rewriting a script? Are you literally putting pen to paper? Are you brainstorming? Are you out watching plays? Did you go to the movie theater just to see a film that you already saw? Are you rewatching a film that you saw 100 times? Are you planning meetings? Are you creating your own stuff? Like the little things is the reason why you're going to be great. So don't neglect the work. Everybody can dream. Do not neglect the work.
Yeah. And I think that concludes this creative conference. So I appreciate everyone for watching. I'm super excited for everyone's career. This is a fun industry. Like, I think, you know, me and Mav have definitely, paved our way and have started, growing a lot of trees within the industry. So I'm excited to see the next generation of Atlanta filmmakers, excited for the Atlanta Film Festival. But yeah, you guys take care and have a great evening, night, day, wherever you're watching this.
Thank you
Bye.
guys, and see you at work.